Is China taking over Africa? If you look this up, you'll find countless news reports and editorials talking about China's rush into Africa, on how China is using its checkbook to take over this continent one nation at a time.
Is Africa walking into a debt trap?
Unsustainable debt.
Crippling debt.
China has flouted every rule that exists.
On the surface, it does look like that's the case. Because in Africa, there is Chinese construction everywhere you look. There are trains, tunnels, dams, mines, ports, you name it. There are too many of these to count. And if you map these projects, you will find that they touch more than 90% of Africa. But reporting of all this construction with billions of dollars in spend and countless Chinese loans is only half the story. And it also fails to explain why Africa, after being robbed of its natural resources by once growing Western influence, would let this happen. It was not that long ago. And after going through more than a century of pain to get back their freedom, why on earth would Africa go through this all over again and cede control? This time to another growing superpower. And only if we dig a little deeper than this narrative of neo-colonialist China taking over tiny African nations and follow the money, we find that there is more to the story than meets the eye. For context, we have to rewind a little. It's the 50s, and we finally decided that we are not going to do this imperialism thing anymore, and the African decolonization began. And as it unfolded, all these rich nations who carved up Africa for themselves, like the British, the French, and others, started to leave, which created a power vacuum within the continent and led to countless brutal civil wars. Fast forward 30 years, all hell broke loose and the whole continent was on fire. Uprisings, coups, and regime changes were common in Africa, and on top of that, diseases like malaria and HIV were wiping out villages. 2 generations at a time.
Haunted everywhere by the grim specter of disease, which constantly saps the strength of these people.
And as you can imagine, at this point, most African countries were also cut off from Western financial markets because naturally, for investors, Africa was a very risky place to do business. So here is Africa, with no access to credit and is behind the rest of the world on every measure of infrastructure possible, from power supply to running water. And at the same time, on the other side of the planet, China was going through a transformation unlike any in recent human history. From an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse in a matter of decades, and it did so mainly by building things. Manufacturing was the backbone of China's meteoric rise, but somewhere around 2010, China ran into a problem. They were running out of things to build. Believe it or not, China had an oversupply of infrastructure. These giant airports, shiny roads, and fancy apartments. Well, as it turns out, there are only so many of these you can build within a country. They started to lose money on these projects, and eventually the profit margins on these projects fell below zero. China's economy was still growing, but with diminishing returns, and the era of double-digit growth was over.
It was only a few years ago that China was experiencing growth rates of 16, 17, 18%.
The world's second largest economy's growth was the slowest in the last 6 years.
The problem here was that the Chinese economy, and with it, the legitimacy of the CCP, the ruling party in China, rested heavily on the continuous growth of its manufacturing industry and excess foreign exchange, which meant that China needed to find new customers for its service and capital fast. And in Africa, they found the perfect match. China had the experience of building everything Africa needed, and in just a few years, Chinese overseas investment exploded. Which brings us to today. Now, unlike the West, Africa has no infrastructure to harness its resources and build a modern economy, and estimates by agencies like the World Bank suggest that Africa's infrastructure needs are somewhere around $130 to $170 billion a year, and the current investments are almost half of what they actually need. And the money that does come in the form of foreign aid has a lot of strings attached, like extensive feasibility studies, environmental guidelines, and conditions of policy reforms. It can easily take years for a project to get approved. To put it another way, aid is free, but quite expensive. On the other hand, the Chinese do not ask any such questions, but only, when can we start digging? And this lack of oversight leaves room for shady backroom deals, kickbacks, and corruption, which are already common across the developing world, and as a result, how far Chinese money will go depends on the country taking the loan. Take a look at Rwanda, for instance. Chinese engineers have designed and built 80% of the country's roads, along with hotels, schools, and hospitals, and since everything is built by China, Rwanda should be drowning in debt. But that's not the case. In fact, quite the opposite. Rwanda has a ruthlessly efficient government and ranks ahead of Germany in the use of its public funds management, which is not a perfect measure, but is not easy to pull off, and it's a result of making good deals with China. On the other hand, in Kenya, China built a $3.6 billion railway from Nairobi and Mombasa.
It's been described as Kenya's biggest infrastructure project since independence more than 50 years ago.
But this project has been losing more than $75 million every year. And this is where the debt trap narrative comes in. But before all of this, before all of the news stories started coming out about growing Chinese influence in the African continent, something happened in 2017 that changed the way we look at China. Between the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal, one of the busiest transcontinental routes lies Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, which was funded by Chinese state-owned Exim Bank for a total cost of $360 million. And after a decade of construction, it was deemed economically unviable by Sri Lanka. And this port is usually cited as a precedent for China's predatory lending practices. It's been all over the news that Sri Lanka had to concede land because they were unable to pay back the loan, and China soon would have a new military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
The port could be used by the Chinese military.
Beijing now exercises de facto sovereign control over the strategic facility.
But what the media either failed to mention or willfully ignored was that China has been involved in the construction or operation of 116 ports in 62 countries all over the world. And of these projects, the Hambantota port is the only one cited as an instance of a debt trap. But in reality, no debt was forgiven and no land was ceded. Sri Lanka did not even have a China debt problem. They had a national debt problem. This is the money Sri Lanka owed to everyone, and the Chinese portion represented just 10% of their total debt. What actually happened was that after a devastating tsunami, Sri Lanka's economy was left in disarray. They needed cash to make pending payments on the international markets and maintain their credit ratings. It was Sri Lanka who approached China, not the other way around. And a Chinese company paid $1.1 billion for a 70% stake on a 99-year lease. And Sri Lanka used this money to pay off its loans. Individual research after research have found that the debt trap narrative is only that, a narrative. According to Chatham House Publishing, China's deal with Sri Lanka was not a debt equity swap, meaning no loan was forgiven, and Sri Lanka did not give up any land. And in the case of Africa, Deborah Brockkim of Johns Hopkins writes, quote, "So far, in Africa, we have not seen any examples where we would say the Chinese deliberately entangled another country in debt." And finally, findings of the Lowy Institute, quote, 90% of China's bilateral loans have gone to countries that could sustainably absorb such debt. China has invested 10,000 projects in over 100 countries. And because of the sheer scale of the lending, some duds were inevitable. And if we take all of Africa's debt, only 8 countries out of 54 account for 90% of the debt owed to China. Not to mention the number of loans they have restructured or simply waived off, which indicates that there is room for negotiation if need be. But make no mistake, none of this is done out of goodness of their heart, as by doing so, China also gains something invaluable, which is political support in the UN General Assembly, where each vote counts and the scales can be tipped in China's favor on international matters such as recognition of Taiwan or South China Sea. The reasons for Chinese investment in Africa seems to be more economic than geopolitical. The problem with the debt trap narrative is that it exonerates corrupt politicians, and the problem with criticizing China for the wrong reasons is that it loses credibility when needed the most. Africa needs partners, and because of the deal they have with China, which is basically infrastructure for natural resources, is the first time Africa has seen any benefit from these resources leaving their continent.